my new sort of jingle intro thing. I'm just trying it out. It might
Very
not
dramatic.
work. I've got a few, actually.
Very dramatic,
So
Mr.
over the
Boone.
coming weeks, I'm going to try them out. Anyway, dun, dun, dun. Welcome to Liverpool Online Music and this week's episode of It's All Just Music, Isn't It?
Hey!
I'm Liam Boom, and this is Phil Beale.
I'm Phil Beale.
And what we're going to do is, as usual, we're going to take a chunk of time, any chunk in the shape of a decade over the last 100 years, and we're going to look at what was the predominant music going on at that time,
Absolutely.
where it came from, what it was all about, where it went, if it disappeared, etc., etc.
That's right.
What we thought of it, what it meant, etc. And we did a lucky dip earlier on, and we came up with the 80s.
Oh, the 80s.
Not my favourite period of time as regards popular music. But we did come up with the 80s.
It's got a bad rep, man. It's got a bad rep.
It's got a bad rep. It's also got
A lot of rap.
It's got a rap in the rep as well. So there's going to be a lot about 80s rap in here. So I was just wondering, usually Professor Phil here does all he doesn't like it when I call him Professor Phil. Professor Phil does most of the research, and he knows loads of stuff, and he knows the ins and outs of a lot of stuff about popular music over the last 100 years. Can't believe it sometimes. Me, I just listen to it and decide like it, not like it, like it, not. A very simple approach, but it is fascinating sometimes, I have to admit. Whoa. When the master over there comes up with some very interesting stuff. So I thought it'd be a smart arse in advance, and I've done a little tiny bit of research, but only a tiny bit because I nodded off right in the middle of my research. Okay, so rap, where did it come from? What does it mean? Etc., etc. I always thought rap was short for rapid because they seem to talk so fast, but rap just means to chat or to tell each other stuff. You know, you could see any two people sitting on a bus talking, so they're just having a rap. But rapping also means, there's a rhythm going on there. So if you put the two together, you're thinking, okay, I can see what's going on.
I'll just put a bit of a curveball in there as well, slightly. It might be something to do with the French word rapport.
Of course, rapport. Well, it's funny you should mention that, because one of the things I discovered, I don't speak French, but I found an old recording of a French guy doing kind of comic monologues with some rhyming sort of rhyme in it over jazz music.
Wow.
In a jazz club in Paris. Amazing. In the 1920s.
In the 20s, really, yeah.
Yeah,
wow.
So there's a little bit of history of sort of talk, stroke, sing over jazz music. There's quite a bit of it around if you look for it. The French seem to have been keen on it in the early days.
Jazz was huge in France.
Massive, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And then if you look at, if you go to the USA and you look at, how a lot of gospel meetings worked, there was often backing singers, there was a piano or an organ going on, and often the pastor or a priest or whatever, he'd get up and he'd be reading parables, but he made it sound cool somehow.
Amazing.
He's reading parables from the Bible, and everyone was joining in, and the backing singers were joining in on the last line or two to double up the last line. So I thought, right, it's all, the bits are all hanging around here and there. And then if we come up to, I don't know, the 60s and 70s, we mustn't forget the beat poets.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, the American beat poets and the British beat poets. Allen Ginsberg was going to jazz clubs and they were letting him read poetry over jazz.
Yes.
And in Liverpool, the Merseybeat poets of the 60s,
absolutely,
Adrian Henry, Roger McGough, Brian Patton.
Absolutely.
They were getting up in clubs and they had a bit of jazz going on in the background.
They were doing that over music, is what you're saying. And I didn't know that, and that's fascinating. But it does lead on to a period that I do know, just to continue that branch, really. Because this almost seems to be like we're developing a tree here. Like a tree of knowledge almost, but we're going back to some sort of rooting system. We're going out on a branch now of poetry to music, and it's obviously very much closely related to rap. But that branch then continued on into the late 70s and the 80s with people like John Cooper Clarke, who we just mentioned, with his wonderful rhythmic poetry, which he does, which he gives over usually a rock backing, but always a musical backing.
Right.
So that's continuity, isn't it?
Yeah,
fabulous.
Okay, so I've gone back a little bit. I mentioned the jazz era of the 1920s, but I was talking to someone who said it goes way back. It goes back into Africa.
I can take you further
200, 500 years ago.
I can take you further back than that. And it's mainly down, my knowledge of this is pretty limited anyway, but it does remind me of the story that Alex Haley put out in his book Roots, and we became that mini series back in the 80s. In the 80s, Appetite, where the person that was the subject of the story went back to Africa to try and find his actual familial roots back across in the old country. And there is a very famous scene where he goes to the village. He tracks down his ancestor to the village, the actual village that they were originally taken from. Goes to that village and he meets a griot, spelt Griot, a French word, probably a French colony, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
And the griot's job is kind of a spiritual headman. His complete role is to remember the history of the village going back almost before time, really, and he would remember that verbally. So he would be taught when he's appointed as the next griot, he has to learn that history verbally, going back into time, and then he has to add on his own lifetime to that, and then he passes that on to the next griot, who does the same. He learns the whole history, and he adds his own part on the top end.
And it helps him to learn and remember if he uses rhythm.
Absolutely.
Now, we had a laugh before because I was talking about remembering in school when you had to learn your times table, and you did it as if it was a song, like 2 4s 8, 4 4s 12.
We all said it, didn't we? All in unison. That's absolutely right.
And I'm just thinking now, I remember, because where I lived as a kid, there was people from all different religious backgrounds, and there were some kids that had to learn religious stuff. I'd go around with a football under my arm, knocking on the door. You coming out to play?
Yeah.
Oh no, I've got to do me Bible studies, or I've got to do me Quran studies, or I've got to do me the Torah studies.
Absolutely,
and that was, to that rhythm, learning loads of, and sometimes kids were learning it in a language that they didn't normally speak or never used other than that reciting. So there's something about, rhyme, rhythm, and keeping the beat going that seems... Because the one thing that always blew my mind about 1980s rap is how do they remember all the bloody words and lines?
I know.
They're rapping for an hour on end on stage.
I'm still in awe.
I still struggle with hickory, dickory, dock, the mouse ran. I struggle with things like that.
Well, I'm a songwriter and I do perform.
Yeah.
And I sometimes struggle to remember my own words. So.
Okay, so... I can believe that as well, folks. I can believe that.
Though.
Okay, we've got like a little potted history that's gone back, to Africa a couple of 100 years, and we've come up through a bit of jazz in the 1920s, the beat poets in the 60s.
That's right.
But what I struggle with, because if I look at a general look at the 70s, it's only a general look, Top of the Pops. Remember Top of the Pops?
Yes.
There was still all kinds of mad glitter stuff going on, wasn't there?
Yes.
So what I don't understand is how come it seemed sudden, probably wasn't, you probably know more about it than me, it seemed like suddenly we went from that to rap, diddy-bap, diddy-rap-bap, suddenly almost overnight, then most of the 80s was...
Well, certainly there's a massive presence in the 80s, but it's quite an interesting story in itself. And we're looking through the UK lens, of course, aren't we? And
of course, yeah.
Because it was an American phenomenon, we are obviously well detached from the origins. I can remember my own introduction to it, so I'll just talk about it for a second.
Yeah.
And that was a brilliant track that just appeared in the charts and on the radio by a band called the Sugar Hill Gang, and Sugar Hill's a district of the Bronx. Okay. And that was really my first hearing of anything that could be defined absolutely as rap. And that was called Rapper's Delight. I loved it so much I went out and bought the 12-inch version of it, because of course you got so much more in the 12-inch version than you did in the 7-inch.
I'm going to be an awkward bugger now and ask you to remind us a little bit of that. How's it go now?
Oh, thank you.
Come on, give us a line or two.
Hip it, hip, hip, happy, don't stop and run to the Batman, up jump the boogie, the rhythm of the boogie the beat.
That actually wasn't bad.
As a white man,
that wasn't bad at all.
Don't ever put that out. Oh no, that's going to be broadcast.
That was okay, actually.
You should get a black man to do that, really, to be fair. Who's well, Tammy said that we've got Eminem, haven't we? So it's not. There's no colour bar. But yes, I'm not a rapper, and I don't pretend to be. But I loved it so much, and it felt like a whole new direction for music, which of course it was.
Sure.
And then from the UK perspective, I think the next great breakthrough was when Blondie picked up on it, and they produced
Blondie,
a brilliant track called Rapture. which you'll probably remember
vaguely.
If you heard it, yeah. It's got a great disco backbeat, and she does a fair job of what she raps out in between the verses, you know.
Right. So was that in the 70s then? Just
no, that would have been following. I mean, Rapper's Delight was it? I just had to check that before we came in today. And Rapper's Delight actually appeared in the charts in 1979 December.
Oh, right, okay.
But was still in the charts in 1980, so it does qualify for the conversation.
Sure.
And it's the start of the global presence of rap,
right?
Which actually obviously originated in America in the late 70s, and we've just spoken. We're obviously here in at Liverpool Online. We are in the building in which there is also a record company. We're surrounded by rappers every day.
Sure, yeah.
So we can take their knowledge as well, you know, and use that. And it's just fascinating to hear about the origins in the States of where rap came from.
So I was trying to work out, you know, how suddenly, you know, we went from people playing loads of instruments on stage, drums and guitars and all this, that and the other, to what seemed like some group of guys. There could be two of them, could be five of them. Often no obvious presence of instruments.
That's right.
There was music coming through. Okay, maybe it was coming through some kind of early version of of computer generated music or something, but they'd gone from loads of instruments and stuff to what seemed like minimalism, but there must have been something going on in the background. So I'm just trying to work out why did that happen? Were these guys suddenly had no money and they couldn't afford instruments? Or
well, to start off with, there were vinyl records that they were just toasting over. I mean, again, that's the Jamaican version. It's called toasting in Jamaica, in the reggae scene. But as we had described just recently, it started off at block parties where DJs will be playing the records. Mm-hmm. And then they'd be introducing it as part of their job to get the crowd going, and then they start making up rhyme to go along with that, just to energise the crowd and the guests at the block party or whatever it was. Yeah. So it started off maybe as a one-off thing, and then it became a much more common practice every weekend, and that's where the American rappers started to work their beats, really, and that's how they created that kind of presence of the spoken word over vinyl records initially. Then the next development of that was to take yet another vinyl record on the sound system and pop the needle on it and spin the vinyl record just through a quadrant and pop it back and get that scratching sound. That's right. Yeah. So that was the next development, really, of that whole thing.
So it seemed that, like, suddenly, almost overnight, loads of people, if they had the ability to do the rap physically, verbally, they could get into it with what seemed like very little or hardly any gear or equipment.
That's right.
Most people that have a turntable at home and some vinyl.
They all got a hi-fi system, haven't they? You know?
Right, okay.
So you adapted that to start with, and then the speakers got bigger and bigger.
So is it a sort of an economical, cheap kind of low-tech way of suddenly just getting yourself into music? Yeah.
Well, for sure. I mean, it came from the roots. It came from what's now known as the projects. It came from those. You know, those
housing estates.
Housing estates,
we call them
and apartment blocks.
Right.
That's what the term block party means, obviously.
Oh, right, okay.
And they'd also get cash for doing it because people would give them small change. You know, if you've got 100 people giving you small change, then you know you've got your night's money. You know?
Okay.
So first of all, it was to standard readily released records, and then rapping over the top of those. And I think technology started to take a hold quite early on in the 80s. In fact, the technology started to appear in the late 70s, really. Coming back to the UK scene, we had the whole synth pop revolution, really, and that really was round about. I think Gary Newman hit the charts with Chibuayami in 1979. So again, we're coming bang into the 80s with Human League.
Yeah,
and they're using sequencers initially in the studio.
Right. Yeah.
So we really are at the very beginnings of computerized backbeats, really. And it was at that time, and of course all that technology started out over the water in the States. They were that much further advanced than us. So sampling became a huge thing at that point.
Right.
And so they started creating their own beats using samples of other people's music, and they would connect them together, and they would the terms mash them up, and then they start rapping over that backbeat. You know,
because it seemed to me that like through the 60s and the 70s, just about every kid at Christmas wanted and got a guitar or an electric guitar. Then suddenly in the 80s, they weren't getting guitars for Christmas. They wanted keyboard things that could do sampling and could do beats.
That's right.
And there was a very famous one. It was only a little keyboard thing, but I can't remember. It was Casio.
Yeah, Casio.
All right, Casio.
Right, yeah.
So loads of kids were getting Casios.
That's right.
Instead of guitars, and they could just press a button and go.
Absolutely right.
And then just start messing around with this, that, and the other, and then rapping over, "Hey, Mum, what's for tea? Hey, Mum, what's for tea?"
Exactly.
And next thing you know, they were doing it. You know, okay, millions of them did it. A few kind of got somewhere with it, but millions of youngsters were doing this. It was very, very popular and very easy and very ready and very accessible. Which brings me on to then, what were those rappers rapping about? Because what sticks in my mind, what seemed to happen, or you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is by the time we got to the mid or the end of the 80s, rap seemed to be a lot about anger and violence and gangs, and everyone was punching their wives and girlfriends and threatening to shoot each other. And some rappers did really get shot. Did it start like that, or was that the music industry trying to make it sexy and exciting?
Obviously, those tragic events were down to money ultimately, and what we're talking about, these block parties developing into sampled beats, original tunes, lyrics, or initially high and about the party and having a good time, but because of course it's from a very disadvantaged disadvantaged background and areas, the grittiness of life has to come through. What has developed at that point is a whole new genre of black music, really, initially to start with, and therefore the black condition comes into it. So again, I'll come back to you, Mr. Boom.
Good.
It's not just music, is it? Because it's all about the conditions you live in, the environment you're raised in, the emotions that creates in you, and how you express that.
Absolutely, that can't be left out. So I was fascinated because some of the earliest 1980s rap music was about people saying, the roof leaks on my housing block, the kids have got nowhere to play, blah, blah. It was almost like the lyricism and ideas of the blues. We're having a bad time here.
You're exactly right.
It's really crap. Now we're doing the blues in a different form.
You're exactly right.
But somehow, in the mid to late 80s, the record companies got hold of it.
Yes.
And they thought, wait a minute, we're not going to sell songs about the roofs leaking and the kids have got no swings to play on. I'll tell you what's fascinating and interesting and everyone loves. Bang, bang, bang. Let's all shoot each other. Let's drive around a massive car. Let's hang around a swimming pool with dozens of girls in their underwear. That sells. So it seemed to me that suddenly rap was hijacked sometime in the 80s and became all about sensationalism and joining a gang and getting a gun and shooting each other and having loads of women, loads of jewellery, loads of dollars. Now, in the early days in the blocks, those people who were having those block parties, they weren't wearing, dripping with gold and throwing dollars around. They were just making do with what they had.
But unfortunately, that sort of style was very much present in their communities, and it wouldn't have been paraded by artists at that point. It would have been paraded by people that were on the dark side of life,
So do you think that some kind of social politics crept in? Because at the beginning, I think rappers were saying there's social injustice here and people should have a close look at it. But when rap was about to explode and make millions, the record companies would have been unlikely to support and promote rappers who were saying this is all the fault of the government and white supremacy and that it's the president's fault that we're all suffering. So it seemed to turn into something else.
I think it went full circle though, Mr. Poon. Sorry to interrupt your line of thought there, but it definitely did, because of course money creates desire, and when you're in a disadvantaged environment, that desire is for the finer things in life. Why wouldn't it be? We would all want that. It probably went right over the top, and you're right, cars, guns, and girls, and all that entails. Great. Then people start getting shot because of the amount of money that's involved in the industry and in the success of that genre. But then you get people like Ice-T at the end of the decade who start to tell people, look, I've been involved in this, and this is not the future, this is not where happiness and peace lie.
All right then.
So then you get, I think, a reversal of that kind of whole, that whole kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? That whole kind of type of art, or that corruption, not the art, I can't say it's corruption, it's very popular, but that subject matter, I think it's turned around again, and people realise that talking about hoes is not exactly the most, elevated way of referring to your partners,
just from the point of view of feminism alone and misogyny, it was a dreadful time,
Absolutely.
And all those girls were roped into sitting around swimming pools in bikinis, and these guys were all saying, look at me bling and look at me jewels and look at me big car. And a lot of those guys who were talking as if they lived right down in the middle of New York and so on, actually lived up in Los Angeles, didn't they? And had minders looking after them and all.
Well, having said that, they were probably, a lot of them were still part of the community anyway. They didn't necessarily gravitate to the posher end because they were still black people, so they wouldn't necessarily have been accepted in the posher ends of
well,
Los
by
Angeles.
the time they were millionaires, they would. They just buy a house and move.
Partly so, but it still wasn't easy, that sort of transition back in the 80s.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's lots of stories, but where am I going with that? I'm just...
Well, I was just going to say, just add one more little thing that might sound daft, but by the time we got to the height of gangster rap, which really wouldn't have worked without MTV and the visuals.
That's right.
It wouldn't have worked without all that movie production that they made,
That's right.
It's fantastic stuff. But in the end, it seemed to me like the whole of that seemed to be just rehashing a slightly updated modern version of West Side Story.
Right.
You've seen the film West Side Story.
Of course, which is Romeo and Juliet.
Sure. It seemed to be that they were just remaking that over and over again, because it was all about the same elements that are contained in that story.
But I think what we need to do is to kind of draw back from that somehow and just look at the progression of the art form, really, and that's what interests me. Sure. And also how it... I love the way that it integrated with other types, particularly during the 80s, with other types of music, and the influences were two-way. We've got bands like Beastie Boys coming out of the punk rock genre or end of things, but using rap as their medium, so you've got a wonderful melting pot of influences all being mixed together, some really wonderful artists coming out of that, and I think the most famous example of that would have been Aerosmith and Run DMC with Walk This Way.
This Way.
Whoa, whoa, what a party record,
that was cool.
Amazing.
That was good.
Really amazing.
Okay, then, so let's see. Okay, I've picked on a few sort of, a bit of the dark side of it, but there's a lot of good stuff. If I was going to put you on the spot and say, okay, what is the best that came out of the 80s rap era, and in your view, what was the worst? I don't necessarily mean pick a particular track. I mean, in terms of musical development, what were we left with at the end of the 80s?
Where are we now, I think? I mean, where are we now? And rap and hip hop and now over on this side of the Atlantic, our own variants of that. They're the dominant musical forces now.
Right.
And we were just having a chat earlier on, weren't we? And what happened during the course of the 80s? It was initiated, it advanced, it crossed over and crossed back again. And then in early 90s, okay, we're moving slightly away again from the 80s particularly, but in the early 90s, Michael Jackson produced a track called Black and White. And in the middle section of that brilliant rock track, ultimately, it's a rock track really. I think it's Slash on guitar, actually, from Guns N' Roses.
Oh, yeah.
There is a brilliant section of rapping in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So that really is, at that point, it goes literally, it goes stratospheric.
Sure.
Really. Michael Jackson's got a rap verse, and now everybody has a rap verse, don't they?
Instead of a guitar break,
exactly, instead of a guitar solo.
But is what you're describing, it's accurate, but I'm just asking you, is it, in your view, is that a good thing that rap became so tame, it was put on a lead and it's in the middle of a Michael Jackson commercial.
I just think that's mature. I think that's what it's not really like that though, because we've had garage and jungle over this side. It keeps changing, so that you may know Jay-Z, but you probably didn't know Stormzy until a couple of years ago.
Sure.
And they're doing different things again with the the language and with the with the whole art form, really. So it continues to evolve, I think.
Right. Okay.
But it really does. It continues to evolve and change. And I'll be honest with you, because I missed it really, because I loved what I heard. I bought tracks here and there. I bought Rapper's Delight. I bought Regulate by Warren G and Nate Dogg, and I just loved the whole sound of it. But I was still really a rock guy, really, into writing my own stuff by that point. And that, so I kind of missed. I've been very conscious of the changeovers in musical culture, like, for example. For us, the first real revolution, of course, in our generation, or just before it was Elvis and rock and roll. Then the Beatles blew that all away, and then the Sex Pistols blew all that away, and then Nirvana blew all that away, and it happens very regularly. And I missed it. I kept saying, "Well, where's the next Nirvana? We haven't got anybody." But it's actually happening. It's actually happening in rap. That's right. That's the roots music. That's this. It starts out as underground music, and it has to. It's a youth movement, and it's not really for you and me to judge.
So do you think it's no? I mean, I wouldn't like to think we'd been judging it as such, talking about it.
I'm just mean it's not for our ears, is all I'm saying, It's not designed for us. It's designed for 17, 16, 15, 14-year-old who are going through those adolescent pangs and experiences. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
just like when your mum and dad said about the Rolling Stones, well, they can't play their instrument, so we just went.
But an interesting thing is that how things sound differently when you go back and listen to them again, and you wonder what was the barrier to you listening to it in the first place. Because, classic example, talking about mums and dads, Top of the Pops was great because the whole family would be sat on the couch watching Top of the Pops. I mean, my dad, we were saying, I've seen the hair on him. Is that a fella or a girl or what? So I found it easy to decide what songs I liked and what I didn't like. Because if my mum or dad or both started tapping their feet and singing along to it, I thought, nah,
it's not for me.
Not for me.
Absolutely.
However,
if they go, you think, yeah.
But what bothered me for years was there was a couple of songs that they liked, and I was adamant, not my stuff. But years and years later, I think actually those songs are okay now when I listen to them. Okay, I know there's a bit of nostalgia and stuff like that thrown in. But they were very much songs of the time. So what I was thinking of, I know this sounds nuts. Okay, you and I, in years to come, when we're aged about 85, sitting on the back seat of a coach, coming back from a day out in Blackpool, we'll probably
with the care home,
we'll probably be all singing something like Bohemian Rhapsody.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. But
we'll be singing Smells Like Teen Spirit, man.
But but does that mean the kids of the 80s who loved all that rap, when they're on the backseat of the coach and they're in their 80s, are they going to be rapping?
They'll probably be doing Rapper's Delight.
You reckon?
I don't know.
I can't wait for that.
Great idea.
There'll also be a fly on the ceiling of that coach if that kicks off. But it would be fascinating, So, I mean, part of the advantage we've got as being slightly older than others is we have experienced so much more stuff.
Yeah.
And I think we're mature enough to go back and listen again. You need maturity for that, really. Because I would never have thought when I was a teenager that in years to come I'd have another listen to the music my parents liked and then go, I see now. I understand why they liked it. I didn't at the time because I associated it with them and I was trying to distance myself from my parents. But now I'm listening to some of the stuff they liked and thought, you know what, it was okay. And I don't mind hearing it now.
Wasn't quite that like that because my parents played a lot. They played the Beatles and they played. I don't ever played the Stones, but I love the Stones. But they played a lot of classical music, and I was like a sponge, and I would soak it up. So I had quite a broad education right from the kick off, really.
Sure.
From the age of 5, I was listening to Scheherazade and loving it, and
that
sort of thing. So I was very lucky, I think. Not everybody gets that.
No, you're right. No,
not everybody gets that. But you're right, and when you get to your teenage years, particularly.
Yeah.
I mean, I was 18 in 1976, for God's sake, when punk was exploding, and my parents weren't into people spitting at each other.
No.
And the hairstyles of wearing bin bags.
Yeah.
That wasn't their style.
Yeah.
So that was a great kind of mini rebellion, because that's what you have as an adolescent. Yeah. You have a mini rebellion.
So do you think as you get older you become more able or capable to listen with young ears again? Because if you kind of missed what happened in the 80s with the rap at the time because you were into other stuff, if you now listen to 80s rap, how do you kind of get it or appreciate it? Or how does it work for you? Okay, do you like it for a start? Do you actually like it?
I did at the time, and I love it now.
Right,
you know.
Okay.
I'm not in any way an expert, the horrible word again, on that genre or that scene.
Sure.
It interests me massively from a social. Its integration with the social scene at the time, you know, that all that stuff has always really fascinated me.
Yeah, me too. I think it's like the politics of it, whether it be capital P or small p politics.
Yeah,
what was going on, social structures and culture,
right.
and all. It's fantastic.
That's what fascinates me.
You know, interestingly enough, I think recently the Rolling Stones have decided to leave one of their famous songs off their playlist, haven't they?
Well, you know what,
Brown Sugar.
That's really funny you should say that.
They've decided to leave it off altogether.
Believe it or not, that was the first album I ever bought as a kid. I was 12 and I bought Sticky Fingers because Brown Sugar was on it. And there's another track on there which is the B-side of Brown Sugar, which is called Bitch.
Yeah.
And it's really strange you raised that now, because I was only thinking the other day, you know, there's no way that you could even play that these days, or even, you know, they're great songs.
Sure.
Musically, they're great songs. But the subject matter it's tasteless, you know.
Sure.
It was tasteless then, but we just rocked along to it. And
but it's taken the Rolling Stones. Are they all in the late 70s, 80-ish? So it's taken them till now to openly say, look, we're not going to do that anymore. It's it's bad taste. Blah blah.
They're
blah,
a bit late to the party, really, to be fair.
Sure.
But God bless them for doing it.
But what about will the 80s rappers ever reach a point where they look back and say we shouldn't have been?
I think they're going through that process. Yeah.
I think right. Okay. And do you think they'll sort of
they've had to
come out with it and say it?
They've had to, because it's just become anathema now. So. It ultimately, let's be cynical. If nothing else, they just won't sell any more records. You know,
right? Okay, yeah. So everyone
because society has changed,
and everyone has to grow up and mature. And
everybody has. Society has to, doesn't it? You know?
And if you want to stay in the spotlight, if you want to be famous and be a star forever and ever, you do at some point have to grow up and mature.
You really do.
In front of the spotlight,
you do,
and it becomes expected of you. And some people do it well, some people don't do it well.
Yes.
There's but growing up and being mature doesn't simply mean carry on doing what you did forever.
No, really.
From 18 to 80.
No.
It does mean some kind of change and development. Says, look, I acknowledge maybe the foolishness of youth. I acknowledge I'm an older person now. I've been through all this experience.
No, we all forgive that.
Now.
We all forgive that if we're reasonable people. We all made those mistakes ourselves, because how can we criticise other people for doing it, you know? But what's the key is that you got to mature and your attitudes have got to change. And, respect for women is one of those key criteria where things have had to change. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you wouldn't get away with it now, as you said.
That's right.
You wouldn't get away with it at all.
But also, the black culture is now, high on the social spectrum as it should always have been. It's been a hell of a long journey for them. Going back to the story of roots, as we mentioned earlier, and going back to Africa,
Yeah, sure.
That's a hell of a long journey. And they're still, I'd say I'm fortunate enough to have been to America recently to visit Memphis, and when I went to see the Stax Museum on my musical kind of pilgrimage, it's in a dreadful area of Memphis, and people are still expected to live like that, unfortunately.
Right, yeah,
in shacks that are falling down.
Yeah.
It's dreadful.
Yeah.
So their condition still in the States is not the way anywhere near what it needs to be.
No. Okay, then. So If we were trying to sum up, we always try and do this sum up, but it's not easy. What we try and do is sum up a decade.
That's really hard, isn't
and
it?
Then,
but I tell you what we have done. We've already, I think, in our conversation so far, we've taken the 80s and said, well, bad reputation, really. The decade that musical taste forgot, or something like that.
Yeah,
but it's not true.
Yeah, no.
There's so much going on at grassroots,
yeah.
particularly with that genre that we've talked about. But not only that, you know, and at the at other levels of society, if you like, particularly in the UK, we started off with Human League and a whole slew of bands. But the other real development in the 80s for me socially was the advent of bands like Bronski Beat, for example, who became the Communards. Soft Cell with Mark Almond, openly gay people, stating, we are gay, deal with it. If you don't like it, tough, because we're making great music and we're really gay.
And it's fascinating that coincides, it almost clashed with the latter end of the 80s when we got the gangster rap, which was often very homophobic. So okay, the 80s then, we've looked at a few decades, and we're trying to look at 10 decades that take us from 2022 back to 1922. We keep jumping across. So how would you rate the decade of the 80s in relation to 100 years of music history? How big or important was the 80s? Come on, Professor.
I'm going to answer the question. but I'm going to just advise us both. We all have our growing period of life and experience, and we always meld to that time and that social stratum and all the stuff that was going on. But we've got to draw back, and we can only admit that every decade is just as important as every other one.
It's the correct answer, folks. Correct answer.
We just have our own favourites at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're right. We do have our own favourites.
Absolutely, yeah. The 80s for me was, I love OMD. We're in Liverpool, you know. Yeah. OMD, I think Andy, whatever his name was, from the Wirral, I think, but they were a Liverpool band.
Yeah.
And Messages is still one of my favourite tracks of all time by OMD, you know. And that was firmly in that techno pop, synth pop kind of genre. Wonderful music came out of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. So and it developed on. And towards the end of the 80s, me as a born rocker, without a doubt, you know, with an older sister in the late 60s, early 70s, I was listening to Hendrix, Deep Purple, you know, great bands, Sabbath from Birmingham, of course. And it kind of got lost in the ether, really, because all the kids had wanted those Casio keyboard things.
Yeah.
And all the music then was all produced, and 808 State and Dance and all that stuff came out. 808 was just one of the processors they used in one of the keyboard samplers or whatever. I started to yearn for a bit of bloody guitar, you know.
Yeah.
And come 87, and God bless him, Johnny Marr met Morrissey somewhere in Manchester at the Boys Club or whatever.
Yeah.
And they just went back to the basics with a voice and a guitar and a bass and a drummer. Yeah. And I was like, hallelujah.
Right, okay then. We're going to wrap up now. One last question. Normally what we do is we just throw a bit of paper out of the hat and we decide what decade we're going to talk about next time. So we don't know for sure. Is there any particular decade you'd really dread, or is there one you'd love to get your teeth into?
I don't dread. I think that my family takes hold ultimately as you grow up. Part of that maturity you're talking about, the maturing process, you know, you get your wife, you get your family, hopefully, or whatever, your partner, and you get your family, and you start growing children.
Sure.
And all of a sudden your involvement in all that stuff has to kind of come to a crashing stop, really.
Yeah.
So if I've got an area of blankness in terms of knowledge of new musical genres, it's really from the mid 2000s and zeros up to now. I mean, my knowledge of what's going on in Liverpool is much better than it was 3 months ago.
Sure, yeah.
But as a general thing, I don't do pop music that much. I don't know current stuff. So I'm a bit of an old git. So therefore, anything up to 2007, 8, 9 probably I can deal with. But
be all right.
After that, I'll be a bit thin on the.
Vague.
We'll have to get another expert.
And what would be your absolute favourite decade if we did a big long special.
Really, the 90s. Really, yeah.
Really,
for me, the 90s, it was just such a fabulous creative decade.
Sure,
such brilliant bands. So yeah,
we're going to leave that till the very end, the 90s, for that reason.
I can't wait.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm getting the nod from the boss there. We've got to wrap up. So
wrap up.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought I'd just throw that in at the end. Okay, so this has been Liverpool Online Music, as you all know. Our little episode has been called "It's All Just Music, Isn't It?" That was me trying to do your accent. Did it work then? It's all just music, isn't it? That's been Phil Beale. I call him Professor. He's not keen on being called Professor. And I've been Liam Boom, and I think I still am Liam Boom, and I intend to continue to be Liam Boom.
You are.
So
in this studio, that's who you are.
Okay. So from Phil and I, it's a goodbye from him, and
that's
goodbye from me too.
Over and out.